My name is Chloe Harrington, and for many years I carried within me a darkness that I tried to justify in every way possible. I grew up believing that no one would come to save me, that the world was a battlefield where only the toughest survived, and that feelings were just burdens that hindered those who needed to move forward. Little by little, I transformed into someone who no longer recognized limits, someone who learned to ignore her own conscience so as not to feel the weight of the choices she made. The truth is, even without admitting it, I was already dead inside long before the day my heart truly stopped. I learned to build a version of myself that seemed strong, invincible, unshakable. It was this version that I presented to the world, a woman who didn't accept orders, didn't recognize rules, and wasn't afraid to confront anyone. But behind this posture lay a heart hardened by traumas, abandonment, and old wounds that I never had the courage to face. Instead, I chose to hide behind behaviors that made me feel powerful for a few moments, even if, deep down, they consumed me completely. As time passed, the Chloe who once only wanted to survive became someone capable of hurting without a second thought. I looked at people and felt nothing. No guilt, no empathy, no regret. Evil became part of my routine, something so common that it no longer scared me. I believed I was in control, that I could decide who deserved respect and who deserved to fall. But it was just an illusion created to hide the ruin growing inside me. I never imagined that one day I would have to face the truth without masks, without excuses, without escape. I never imagined that there was a higher court than any earthly judgment. I only discovered this the moment life slipped from my body, and it was there, in the silence between a last breath and the unknown, that everything began to change irreversibly. I know this story has already touched you deeply. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like before continuing. This helps this message reach other people who also need to face truths that come to light when the masks finally fall. Stay with me, because what happened after that last breath reveals a reality that no one is prepared to face. When I think about the life I led before I died, I realize how blinded I was by the illusion of power that crime offered me. I, Chloe Harrington, got used to believing that easy money was an open door to the freedom I never had in childhood. And so I clung to that world as if it were the only place where I could truly exist without being trampled on. It all started with small favors, small deliveries, small lies that seemed harmless, until these small concessions transformed into a web of actions that completely consumed me. Each step I took towards crime distanced me further from the person I was and brought me closer to a distorted version of myself, a version I fed with unhealthy pride and forced bravery. Over time, I began to feel a dangerous pleasure in being feared. There was something intoxicating in the way people lowered their eyes when I passed by, or in the way my name circulated through the streets as if it carried a weight greater than my own story. I lived surrounded by people, but I had never been so alone, and this silent solitude pushed me even deeper into a lifestyle where I seemed to have control over everything, when in reality, I was only being manipulated by my own wounds. The constant adrenaline, the sleepless nights, the secrets kept in silence. All of this created the false impression that I had finally found my place in the world, when in reality I was building my own prison, brick by brick, without noticing the darkness that enveloped me. The quick money was becoming increasingly addictive, and before I knew it, I was immersed in a chaos that seemed impossible to escape. Crime gave me a sense of importance I never felt at home, and that's why I stayed, even knowing deep down that none of it was real. But life has a relentless way of revealing how small we are in the face of the choices we make. And that feeling of invincibility began to crumble slowly, paving the way for something much bigger that I couldn't yet see. The truth is, when I look at my story honestly, I realized it wasn't one big event that dragged me into the abyss, but rather a small, seemingly insignificant decision that opened the door to everything that would come after. I remember exactly the day I crossed that point of no return. It was when I agreed to do something that at the time I considered just a favor, something no one would find out about and that, according to myself, wouldn't hurt anyone. However, at that moment, something inside me changed imperceptibly, as if a crack had appeared in a wall I believed to be unbreakable. The feeling of power I felt when I carried out that action was as quick as it was addictive, and even though my conscience tried to whisper that it was wrong, I decided to silence it before it could make me hesitate. That first choice, which could have been interrupted with a simple no, ended up becoming the beginning of a cycle where each new step seemed easier than the last. With each small transgression, I distanced myself further from the Chloe, who still retained some sense of right and wrong, the one who was still afraid of moral failure, the one who still desired, even timidly, a life that didn't need secrets to exist. However, sin has the ability to present itself as something comfortable, almost inevitable, until you find yourself so involved in it that you can no longer remember who you were before it entered. And that's what happened to me. I found myself trapped in a labyrinth of my own making, convinced that I could control the consequences while, in reality, I was being dragged along by them. It was in this silent process of self-destruction that I realized, much later, that sin doesn't need wide open doors to enter. It is content with small gaps, opened by seemingly harmless oversights. And little did I know that that forced concession would be remembered before me at the moment of my spiritual judgment, when there would be no way to deny the impact of that initial choice. And have you ever noticed that sometimes the greatest danger begins with what seems too small to be taken seriously? Share with me in the comments, what small opening has God warned you to close? As the years went by, I realized that something inside me was deteriorating so subtly that when I finally noticed, there was almost nothing left to save. Indifference, that silent weapon that sin uses to harden hearts, took hold of me to such an extent that I no longer knew how to identify compassion, mercy, or empathy. I, Chloe Harrington, became someone who looked at the pain of others as if it were just an inconvenient detail along the way. Each person I hurt ceased to be a human being and became merely a replaceable piece on a chessboard that I thought I controlled. I didn't realize that by hurting others, it was my own soul that was slowly bleeding, even though I insisted on pretending that none of it mattered. The normalization of evil happened so progressively that violence, once a source of fear, became routine. My heart became so insensitive that I no longer reacted to the suffering I caused, as if I were anesthetized by a darkness that seeped into all my thoughts. I had lost the sense of what made me human, allowing coldness to mold me according to patterns I would never have accepted at another stage of my life. People who tried to warn me were pushed away with aggression or contempt, because I believed that only the weak allowed themselves to be influenced by conscience. In my arrogance, I thought I was protected by the fear I inspired in others, without imagining that the true danger was approaching within me, silent, patient, deadly. It was at this point in my journey that something began to become evident, even though I tried to ignore it. Every time I hurt someone, something inside me died too, even though I didn't recognize the origin of this inner death. The indifference, which I considered a shield, was actually living proof that my soul was slowly fading away, like a flame suffocated without oxygen. However, I could never have imagined that very soon, this flame would be extinguished in a way that no human force could rekindle, and that the greatest revelation of my life would not come while I was breathing, but the instant my breath ceased. I always imagined that if I ever met death, it would be in a situation I could foresee, a direct result of the choices I made, something that would happen during a confrontation or in a moment of extreme tension. So, when that day arrived, it surprised me in such a brutal way that even today, I have difficulty explaining how everything happened so quickly. I remember being on a street I knew well, surrounded by people with whom I had shared dark secrets, wrong convictions, and impulsive decisions. The atmosphere seemed the same as always, charged with distrust and adrenaline, but that day there was something different in the air, something I couldn't name, but that made my heart beat faster, as if my body knew in advance what my mind still refused to understand. The argument began like so many others I had faced before, with raised voices, veiled threats, and glances that betrayed both fear and anger. I was used to that kind of environment, so familiar that I came to believe I was immune to the risks it carried. It was in that moment of false security that I heard the sound that changed everything. It wasn't a shot fired at me in a planned way, as so many would believe. It was stranger, more unforeseen, almost as if fate had decided to intervene in the most unexpected way possible. The shot echoed so quickly that I barely had time to react. I felt the impact even before understanding where it came from, as if the world had decided to spin in another direction without warning me. As my body fell to the ground, a cold sensation ran through my skin. But what truly frightened me was realizing that I didn't feel pain in the way I had imagined. My vision blurred. The voices around me seemed distant, as if I were trapped between two worlds, without the strength to remain in either. I tried to breathe, but my chest wouldn't respond. And at that moment, a strange silence took hold of me, a silence so profound. It seemed to separate who I was from who I was about to discover. I believed that death would be the end, but at that very moment I realized that something much greater and infinitely more revealing was only just beginning. When my body finally succumbed to the impact, I thought it would all end there, on the cold ground, surrounded by confused screams and footsteps running in directions that no longer made sense to me. However, what happened in the following moments ripped me from any notion of reality I thought I understood. I felt as if something was being pulled from inside me, gently and yet inevitably, as if an invisible force had decided to separate what was matter from what was essence. It was then that I realized, with disturbing clarity, that I was still there, but not in that body that was agonizing before my eyes. My first sensation was one of utter bewilderment. I found myself lying on the floor, motionless, pale, with my eyes half closed, while my breath seemed to struggle futilely to exist. Yet at the same time, I was standing, observing everything from an impossible angle, as if I were a spectator of my own death. My first impulse was to try to get someone's attention, to scream, to touch someone, to do anything to interrupt that nightmare. But my hands moved through the air without encountering resistance, as if I no longer belonged to the space around me. Despair grew rapidly, rising through my consciousness like a wave threatening to engulf everything, because for the first time I understood something I had always ignored. I no longer had control over absolutely anything. The voices of the people became muffled, distant, like echoes of a reality that was beginning to dissolve before me. There was no physical pain, but there was an emotional weight so profound that it seemed to crush my soul, as if all my mistakes were there with me, staring back at me. The street, once so familiar, transformed into a hazy scene, as if being engulfed by a kind of spiritual fog that tormented my senses. With each passing second, I had the feeling of drifting further away from the world I knew, as if I were being slowly pulled to another place. It was then that I felt, behind me, a presence so intense that my whole being reacted, not with fear, but with a revelation I never would have imagined facing at that moment. As that presence drew near, I felt something I had never felt before, something that surpassed any human sensation I could compare it to. It wasn't heat, it wasn't cold, it wasn't wind, It wasn't sound. It was as if truth itself were walking toward me, stripping every part of me bare without needing to touch my body or utter a single word. I realized there was no point in trying to escape because there was nowhere to go there. And even if there were, I knew my spiritual feet wouldn't obey the desperate desire to hide. There was an irresistible force drawing me in, a force that wasn't violent but absolute, as if everything that existed bowed before it. That's when I saw him. Not as I imagined him, not like so many images and paintings I'd seen in my life, but as someone who carried within himself such pure authority that my whole soul trembled. His face wasn't one of anger, but neither was it one of immediate consolation. It was a face that reflected the truth about who he was, and consequently, about who I had become. When his eyes turned to me, I felt as if I were being pierced by a light that didn't burn my skin, but exposed my soul. There was no room there for lies, justifications, rehearsed speeches, or emotional excuses. Before him, conscience itself became witness, accusation, and sentence all at once. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Not because he stopped me, but because I finally understood that there was nothing that could be said to cover up what I had done. It was as if every face of the people I had hurt was reflected in his eyes, not as condemnation, but as undeniable truth. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to point a finger, didn't need to enumerate my sins. His mere presence was enough for me to see myself exactly as I always was, without masks, without defensiveness, without illusions. And it was precisely at that moment, when I thought I had already felt the full weight of the truth, that he did something I never imagined. And the revelation that followed would change everything I believed about destiny, justice, and eternity. When Jesus raised his hand toward me, I didn't feel condemnation as many imagine, but a truth so profound that it pierced my soul as if opening every memory I had buried, every choice I preferred to forget, every mark I left on others without ever looking back. It was as if an entire dimension unfolded before me, revealing not only what I had done, but the invisible impact of every action I had taken, like waves that spread even after the initial movement ceases. He showed me that sin is never isolated. It always follows a trail, always touches someone beyond its intended target, always destroys more than we can perceive while we are alive. I saw faces I tried not to carry in my memory, people I hurt out of pride, ambition, anger, fear. I saw their expressions the exact second pain reached them, and for the first time, I felt not only what I had done, but what each of them felt. Jesus didn't show me that to humiliate me, but to reveal something I never understood while I was alive. The choices we make become eternal paths, because they shape not only the present, but also destinies that never return to the starting point. And then he showed me a place. It wasn't a hell filled with flames, as many imagine, but a space of absolute absence of God's presence, a void so profound that fear became a small shadow in the face of the despair that spread there. It was like contemplating eternity without light, without hope, without the possibility of return. He made me understand that this was the destiny of those who, like me, walk through life believing they can ignore grace until the very last moment. It wasn't God condemning, it was humanity itself choosing to live far from him and reaping the consequences forever. I felt the weight of that revelation with a force that crushed everything within me, as if my soul were about to crumble before the truth unfolding before my eyes. However, just when I thought I was about to be pushed in that eternal, irreversible direction, something completely unexpected happened, something that no earthly judgment could ever offer. When I stood before that place of utter absence, feeling the weight of the consequences I had chosen to carry throughout my life, something inside me finally broke. For the first time since childhood, I felt my heart bow, not before fear, but before a truth so pure that no resistance could stand. There, before eternity, I realized how long I had lived trapped in a distorted version of myself, shaped by pain, selfishness, violence, and pride. It was at that moment, when darkness seemed about to engulf me completely, that I felt something unexpected, a kind of mercy I never imagined could still reach someone like me. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and his touch was not one of condemnation, but of opportunity, an opportunity I could never have anticipated. There wasn't enough pride in me to stop me from crying with all the strength my soul possessed, because at that moment I realized that true repentance doesn't spring from superficial guilt, but from direct confrontation with who we are when all the masks fall. I saw myself as small, broken, imperfect, and finally admitted what I had spent my life denying. I needed forgiveness. I needed to be restored. I needed to be transformed by something greater than my own strength, because it was never enough to save me. When he looked at me again, a silent decision was being made before me, as if he were offering me not just a return, but a complete reconstruction. I felt as if I were being pulled back into my body, as if every cell was responding to the call of a new opportunity that I could never deserve, but which was nevertheless being extended to me. The physical pain returned, air abruptly rushed into my lungs, and a cry escaped my throat, as if I were being reborn at that very moment. I woke up surrounded by stunned people, some believing I had left, others not understanding what was happening. I myself didn't understand how I was alive, until I realized that this second chance carried a responsibility that would change everything that lay ahead. But the true impact of this change would only be revealed later, in a way I could never have predicted. From the moment I returned to life, I carried within me a consciousness that never left me. I, Chloe Harrington, understood that the mercy that reached me at that instant was not a prize, not something I deserved, nor an inexplicable coincidence. It was a calling, a profound, direct, irrefutable calling that confronted every part of my being and reminded me that no one crosses eternity unscathed when carrying a life built on choices that wound, destroy, and harden the soul. The vision that Jesus showed me, the truth he placed before me, and the silent pain of the lives I marked have become part of who I am now. As much as I wished to erase my past, I discovered that God doesn't rewrite our history simply by erasing what we were, but by transforming who we become when we choose to surrender what remains into his hands. Over time, I realized there's a huge difference between knowing God exists and living as if he were real. For years, I walked as one who acknowledges the existence of a higher power, but at the same time, lived as if I would never have to confront it. I believed I could ignore him, circumvent his laws, silence the whispers of conscience whenever they bothered me, and move forward, believing that if I didn't look at him, he wouldn't look at me either. But when I stood before his eyes, I understood with indescribable clarity that no one deceives God. He sees what we try to hide. He knows what we pretend not to feel. He examines what we think no one will ever discover. Every secret thought, every disguised intention, every stifled emotion was there before him, exposed with an honesty that no words could mask. And yet, even in the face of all my filth, Jesus chose to offer me a new chance. The grace I found wasn't light, it wasn't romantic, it wasn't emotionally comfortable. It was a grace that pierced me like a sword, revealing everything I was, everything I had become, and everything I could be if I finally chose truth instead of shadows. This grace demands change. It demands renunciation. It demands courage to dismantle every lie we've built over time and face the inner ruins we've avoided out of fear, shame, or pride. Since then, I've begun to understand that living is a profound spiritual responsibility. Every choice, every word, every silence, and every step brings us closer to or further away from what God wants to restore within us. Life isn't just a series of passing days. It's a constant construction of who we are becoming. And realizing this, I felt an enormous weight for how I wasted so many opportunities, so many lights, so many warnings that God sent before allowing me to touch eternity. I realized that He had already tried to speak to me many times, but I was too busy running away from what I needed to face. If I am here today, breathing, recounting this experience, it is because God decided that there was still something in me that could be restored, something that could be transformed, something that still had value for the purpose He established. I don't say this with pride, because I know exactly what I did and what I allowed my soul to become. I say this with fear, with gratitude, and with a responsibility that I carry every day since I returned. And I need to tell you, with all the sincerity my soul can bear, don't wait to cross death to discover what God is trying to show you now. Don't wait to lose everything to realize your heart is growing cold. Don't wait for despair to finally seek the light that has always been within your reach. Late regret hurts in a way that no words can describe. Seeing your entire life before you, unfiltered, without excuses, without watered-down versions, is something that scars the soul forever. I lived through it, and I would never wish you to experience it the same way. If my story touched your heart, perhaps it's because the Holy Spirit is calling you, nudging what you try to silence, drawing you closer before the world manages to push you away for good. If this story touched you, don't leave this video without reflecting deeply. Subscribe to the channel, walk with me on this spiritual journey, and share in the comments what God spoke to your heart. Your story can also be transformed, and perhaps the change begins today.